Going to be looking at 2 Corinthians chapters 10 and 11 tonight. Of course, before we get into the text itself, we usually have a question that kind of deals with one of the main subjects that we're going to look at tonight. Tonight's no different. Question number 1 on your handout. And pretty simple question, but the question is, do you like to listen to somebody brag about themselves or not? How many people like to listen to people brag about themselves?
Depends on the subject.
On the subject?
Yeah, fishing.
Okay. Well, I've heard a few fishermen brag, haven't you? I don't know how much you can believe it, but why is that the case? Why don't we like to listen to people brag about themselves?
It makes people seem arrogant and full of themselves. Although, in fairness, if they have a good reason, like, and that may sound funny, but if they have something legitimately to talk about, and you're bragging about your new truck. Congratulations, you got a new truck, and how you make $196,000 a year. Congratulations. But if you want to brag about, well, I don't know, you were fishing and you saw somebody drowning and you saved them, yeah, I'll hear that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a little more noble cause, I would say, wouldn't you?
Yeah, if it's something where you're like, yeah, I want to hear that, so I can congratulate you and tell you that's awesome.
Yeah, and I think generally when we think of, people bragging about themselves, it's not just that they, their main objective is to lift themselves up, but it's really to push everybody down around them, isn't it? And isn't that why a lot of people brag about themselves? They feel, they feel like they're better than everybody else for whatever reason, or superior in some area in talent, and so they feel like they have to make themselves stand out, and the way that they do that is by talking about themselves, about how good they are in certain areas. So, do you have a comment?
I've heard it said if you're really good at something or talented in something, that you don't have to brag about yourself. Somebody else is going to do that for you if you're really genuinely talented.
Yeah.
Whatever that is.
Yeah, and that's generally across the board too. You guys know I watch a lot of sports, but man, the one thing that I can't stand are arrogant athletes, and unfortunately there's a lot of them. They'll tell you about how good they are, but like Adam said, if somebody's really good at something, do they have to brag about themselves for everybody to know that? I mean, it's generally something you notice and pick up on, and other people are going to talk about it openly.
Same in business.
Yep.
If you advertise or if you don't advertise, we've never advertised.
Yeah.
Never. We don't need to.
Yeah, well, people who are good at it, the word gets around, doesn't it? Yeah, they don't have to.
Line too.
Yep, that's right.
I've heard a lion doesn't have to tell the other animals he's blind.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that'd be a good way to put it. So the reason to kind of ask that question got us to thinking about that is because as you read through chapters 10 and 11 here, obviously there's a lot of boasting that Paul does about himself. And we don't want to get the wrong impression from it. And of course, throughout it, Paul's talking about, how embarrassed he is that he even has to do this. But there were some people, of course, who always questioned Paul, who always tried to paint a bad picture of Paul in somebody else's in the eyes of other people. And sometimes people can say stuff about you, and probably the best thing to do is just say nothing. But aren't there also other times when you have to defend yourself? I mean, maybe the charges are so heinous, or maybe there's things that are at stake if you don't say something. And so it's not necessarily that you're defending your ego, so to speak, but there's other important matters that are going to be affected by this if you don't say something. And that's kind of the way it was with Paul, wasn't it? Because if he didn't say something, to the church about his motivation, why he was doing what he was doing, his credentials, then there was a danger that what would happen?
You ever heard cause of Christ.
Yeah, it would hurt the cause of Christ, and ultimately it was going to turn them away from the truth. They were going to listen to these false teachers and, of course, go off course. And Paul did not want that to happen, couldn't let it happen, couldn't just sit by and, idly and say nothing. And so there is a lot of what we would think of maybe bragging or boasting, but understand kind of the purpose behind why Paul is doing what he's doing. So if you look at the first part here in chapter 10, question number 2, of what did Paul's opponents accuse him? There are several things that they accused him of, but specifically there in verse 2.
Accused him of being bold.
Okay, yeah. He was certainly a bold individual at times, wasn't he? One of the things that you'll find in these 2 chapters, though, were they really impressed or intimidated by Paul's physical letters, by his physical presence?
Well, he was a good speaker of them, and they said he was bold in letters, and when he got there, he was meek.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So one of the accusations that they made about him is he's not as fierce as you think he is. When he writes letters, he pretends like he's this big guy and he's something to be dealt with. But now when he's here in the flesh, it's going to be a different story. He's this mild and meek person, and so he writes these bold letters. But as far as his physical presence, they weren't very impressed by that. What else do they say about him there in verse 2?
Said accused of walking according to the flesh, which I take that to mean that maybe he was doing it for personal gain, or for glory, or fame, something to benefit himself.
Yeah, I'd say that would probably be the heart of the accusation. Of course, to walk after the flesh would be, to walk as a way of life, a manner of living, but to be motivated by the flesh, by the physical, by the carnal things. And could you have said that, about Paul and his possessions? I don't think they were saying that, do you? But like Darrell pointed out, I think more what they're talking about is, his personal interest is what they thought Paul had in mind, whether it was exercising dominion over people or, gaining popularity among the people. Paul was motivated by fleshly fame and popularity. And so evidently that's again one of the accusations that they bring against him. So how does Paul combat that idea? Let's talk about question number 3 there. How were the weapons that Paul used different from ordinary weapons?
He compares it to warfare. He's saying it's not physical, it's spiritual. My weapons are spiritual weapons.
Yeah, so Paul says, if I'm this fleshly minded individual, where are my fleshly weapons? Show me the fleshly war that I'm fighting here. Show me the fleshly enemy that I'm engaging. And, he didn't deny that he's mortal. All of us are mortal in nature. And of course, there's certain things that we have to do. We've got to devote some time and some care to the flesh, don't we? But Paul did that, but that wasn't his main focus in life. When you think about what he did and how he engaged in this spiritual warfare. And so one of the arguments that he makes here is, if I'm so physically motivated, where are my weapons? The weapons that I'm using aren't physical in nature. The war that I'm fighting is not physical. Physical isn't my motivation. They said those things that are motivating me are spiritual. And of course, if you're fighting a spiritual war, are physical weapons going to be good in a spiritual war? Not going to work in a spiritual war. You've got to have some different types of weapons if you're fighting a spiritual war. So that's one of the points he makes. So question number 4 is this. Why was Paul not ashamed to boast to the Corinthians about some of these things? We're going to get into some of the specifics here as we go through these 2 chapters.
Because his authority came from the Lord and not from him.
Yeah, why was Paul doing what he was doing?
To help him.
Yeah, to help him. And really I guess the point that I'm driving at is, Paul didn't Paul just didn't dream up one day in his head, hey, I'm going to go out here and be a missionary. I'm going to go out here and go all the world and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. How did he start doing that? Or why did he start doing that?
The Lord's invitation.
Yeah. Well, Jesus himself chose him, didn't he? He chose him, he empowered him, and he gave him that mission. And so when you're talking about the work that Paul was doing, Paul wasn't bragging, this is something that I did and dreamed up, and, I've got this power and this ability, and now I go out here and did this all on my own. He was talking about the fact that he was being obedient to Christ. And so he was fulfilling this divine commandment, this divine mission that had been given to him by God. And basically, what did that involve? What does he say there in what are we looking at? Verse 8?
He's saying that he wasn't edified for their destruction, but for the elevation of the Lord's.
Yeah, God didn't send him out here to destroy everybody, did he? What did he send him out there to do?
Satan.
Yeah, build up, right? So he converted people. He sought out the lost, saved them. How many congregations did he establish? He was out here doing positive things. He wasn't out here doing negative things. And so he wasn't ashamed of this work because of the nature of it. It was positive in nature. He was building people up. He was establishing congregations of the Lord's church, and that's what Christ had told him to do. And so he wasn't talking about this work from an egotistical standpoint. Look what I did and look what I've been able to accomplish. But the fact that the Lord sent him and this was his mission in life.
Doesn't that sort of tell us, if Paul, who could do miracles, received direct communication from Christ, couldn't get away from drama and people trying to cause division problems, we're not going to either.
Yeah.
Because, he could literally do a miracle and back up what he was saying. This is how it is, God told me so.
Yeah, and not just him. Even when you think about the life of Christ on earth, people were the same way. There were all kinds of accusations. They could see a miracle right in front of their face, but still not believe Jesus was who he was and accuse him of false motives. And Paul was no different. So, like you said, if that's the way it was with a guy who was an apostle and miraculously endowed, how's it going to be with us today? Should we expect anything differently? Sometimes people are going to, whenever they ask themselves the reason, why is this person serving Christ? Or why are they doing these good things? Some people are going to have, false ideas and motives in mind as to why we're doing that. But again, it's our mission, isn't it? We're servants of Christ. That's the work that Christ gave us to do. Nothing to be ashamed about. Just go out and do the work. So Paul did talk about it. He wasn't ashamed to talk about it because it was a divine mission. And it was a positive mission in nature. The things that he was doing was very profitable and positive to people and beneficial toward God in the sense that that's what God wanted him to do. Question number 5, we kind of covered that there. Why was Paul justified in boasting, whereas his opponents was not? Another thing, though, to think about there is, what was Paul's, I don't want to say, official title? Although it wasn't an official title.
Apostle.
He was an apostle, right? And what does that mean?
He got his stuff directly from Jesus to cut it out to him.
Yeah. And so these other guys, they were claiming to be servants of Christ too. But listen, if you want to talk about being a servant of Christ, who had the upper hand here? The guy who was hand chosen by Jesus himself and appointed into that office. So was he justified in his boasting? Sure. He was an apostle. They were not apostles. He had authority, didn't he? Jesus gave the apostles authority. They didn't have that authority that he had. And so, humanly speaking, again, from that standpoint, if you want to talk about who should be bragging and who shouldn't, if anybody should be bragging about anything, it should have been Paul, shouldn't it? Because he was the one who had the upper hand, so to speak. So Paul's really concerned about these false apostles, these men that are swaying the mind of the church at Corinth. And ultimately, the goal is going to be to push them toward, like all these letters that we read about, Judaism. I mean, that was really the goal, discredit Paul and push people back toward the law of Moses specifically. But Paul's really concerned about it. And in chapter 11, of course, he writes about it. Why does Paul, he uses some pretty strange language when you read through there, but why does Paul ask the Corinthians to put up with him there in verse 1?
Well, he's about to brag on himself.
Yeah, he's getting ready to unleash, isn't he? and again, he just wants to remind them, it's been said, desperate situations calls for desperate measures. Well, sometimes that's true. And so this was a desperate situation. This is what it called for, because the Christians, the church at Corinth, were listening to these men because they were talking about how great people they were. About all these things that they accomplished, and all this power and this authority that they had. Remember the letters we read about a little bit earlier, letters of recommendation. So Paul says, you guys, you got to bear with me for a minute here, and it's not something that Paul really wanted to do, but as you go through chapter 11, what you'll find is Paul had a sense of humor. I understand that when reading this chapter. Because there's some irony that he uses there. There's some sarcasm. He even plays on words every once in a while when he's talking about this idea of boasting. And so basically what he tells them in this chapter is, listen, you guys like to listen to fools talk so much, you're going to love what I got to say to you. Because Paul said, this is foolish that I have to speak to you like this, but that's the way you want to listen. And so I've got to speak to you this way so I can get your attention. So question number 7, he talks about him being jealous. Who was he jealous of? Verse 2 there of chapter 11.
He's jealous over the congregation.
Yeah, and so why was he jealous over the congregation?
It is Christ and his people. Sorry, Dennis, go ahead.
Afraid that they'd go all jealous of what they believed in, and they would pull them away.
Yeah. What were you going to say, Adam?
That it was Christ is who he had given them to, and somebody else is trying to take them away from Christ.
Yeah, one of the ways the Bible describes a Christian's relationship to Jesus is the idea of a betrothal, or we might better say in our society, marriage. The church is the bride, Jesus is the husband. And so Paul says, I'm worried that you're going to cheat on your husband. And I'm worried that these people are turning you away from being faithful to your husband. So I'm jealous over you with a godly jealousy, because you're being tempted by these false teachers. You're being tempted to be unfaithful to your husband. And so, Paul had a reason to be jealous. And of course, some people say it's the idea of a father betrothing his daughter to somebody. Maybe that's true. I don't know. But, a father would have been pretty protective of his daughter if he had promised her to another guy in marriage, wouldn't he? And he would have done everything within his power in that day and age to keep anything bad from happening. And so maybe that's a good analogy there.
Verse 3, he compared it to a serpent and Eve.
Yeah. And that's our next question there. We'll just roll right in line there. But what biblical event did he compare the Corinthians' risk of deception to? Well, Eve, right? In the Garden of Eden. And think about that for a minute. Where did Eve go wrong in the Garden of Eden? Okay, she listened to him, but why did she listen?
She believed a lie.
One word.
Yeah.
Three words.
Yeah. Satan just changed one word, right? Thou shalt not surely die, where God said, you will surely die if you eat of this tree. But she believed what Satan told her. She believed a lie, deception. That's how Satan accomplished it, right? And what did deception do? What did it do to her relationship with God? Destroyed it, didn't it? And so that's what Paul's talking about here. Deception destroyed Eve's relationship with God, because caused her to turn away from the truth and believe a lie. And he said, I'm worried about you guys. Same thing's going to happen. You know, these people are using deception, and you're going to believe what they're telling you, and that's going to cause you to turn away from the truth, and you're going to believe a lie, and then your relationship with God is not going to be what it's supposed to be. So Paul, I mentioned he uses a lot of different ideas. Sarcasm is one of them that he uses throughout this chapter. He talks about there in verse 5, super apostles. You know, either these guys out here, they're these guys who they're the chief apostles. Why does he talk about them that way?
They apparently had set themselves up to be that way.
What made them a super apostle, though, in their own words? Or what made Paul inferior to them, maybe we should say?
His speech.
Yeah. His speech or his speaking abilities. Right? And I've said this before, but that's one of the interesting things to me when you read about these great men in the Bible, even Jesus himself. Why did people listen to him? It wasn't because they had this great ability to speak. You know, that wasn't where the power and the draw was in what these men were doing. And so Paul, he talks about this idea, you know, yeah, my speech is weak. I acknowledge that. I'm not the best speaker out there. But what was he strong in? Knowledge. Truth. Right? And that's the power. That's the power of the message, isn't it? It's the content. It's the knowledge that's being imparted to us. Paul knew about it. What Paul said was true. And so, yeah, he may not have been the best speaker. They may have had a better ability than he did. But that's not what makes a super apostle. He said that's not the power of an apostle. The power of an apostle lies in the knowledge, doesn't it? It lies in the fact that they possess the truth. And so their criticism of Paul was that he wasn't gifted enough. You know, you could tell that if you ever listened to him. There's no way that he could be an apostle because he didn't have a great ability to speak. So how did Paul, question 11 here, how does Paul's behavior contrast with that of some of his opponents? What are some of the ways that they were different from one another? He talks about there in verses 7 through 12.
Apparently, they had come with their own asking for money, and he came. Other people had fed him.
Yeah, and you know we've talked about this in several different classes, both on Wednesdays and Sundays out here in the adult classes. But what was Paul's practice financially whenever he went somewhere to preach the gospel?
He did it for free. He didn't take up a collection to support himself.
He also worked.
Yeah, he did not, whatever area he was working in, he didn't take any money from that area that he was working in. He didn't take any money from those people. So he would go there, he would work. Like Adam pointed out, sometimes he had to work with his own hands, didn't he? Sometimes he had to build tents and make money from that. How did he make it through here? Yeah, Corinth didn't give him any money, but other congregations did. So he would take, you know, contributions from other congregations, but as far as working in the area that he was working in, he didn't want to burden those people in any way, in part because he didn't want them to think that he was doing it for financial gain, for profit. You know, he didn't want to be a hindrance to the gospel, to them accepting the gospel in any way. And it's kind of ironic, you know, that here he is, he won't even take any money, and now these false apostles are using that against him. How do you use that against somebody?
Sarcasm.
Well, they said if he was really an apostle, he would take your money. You know, so that's how you know he's not an apostle, because he knows he's not qualified, and he's afraid to take your money because he's not qualified. Doesn't meet the criteria. So, you know, Paul couldn't win for losing, could he? I mean, everything that he did was was dissected and criticized in some way or another. But basically, they were making that accusation. Well, the reason he won't take your money is because he's not any good. He doesn't have any speaking ability, and he really doesn't care for you guys anyway. Let's talk about the end here of chapter 11. Got just a few questions left. Again, in verse 16 here of chapter 11, Paul basically says, I don't want any of you guys to think me a fool. So why does he write that?
I'm only doing this because I have to.
Yeah, Paul was not happy that they reduced him to this level. He thought it was just foolishness to have to talk to somebody like this. But again, that's what got their attention, wasn't it? That's why they were listening to these other people. And so Paul said, you've reduced me to this level. I have to reach out to you and speak to you on this level. Didn't want to do it, but it needed to be done. And so Paul was really willing to do it in order to, again, benefit them and the cause of Christ. Question number 14 here. What did the Corinthians put up with too easily? You read in verses 19 through 20 there, some of the things that they put up with from these other guys. What was some of it?
Well, they allowed themselves to be around fools, which elevated them to look like they were wise. That's why they allowed that.
Yeah, I mean, you read about what he talks about there in verse 20 specifically. Here they were, the gospel, the truth had set them free. Now these guys are trying to bring them back into bondage. And what do? Oh, these are good guys over here. We'll listen to whatever they have to tell us. He also talks about the idea of devouring them. Well, that's again taking things from them, devouring their living. They weren't ashamed to take money from them or take gifts or their charity, and so they were just heaping up the things that they were given to it. But did that bother the church of Corinth? No, they were going to put up with that, weren't they? He also talked about what was one of the other ones? Oh, lording over them. These people were just bossing them around, telling them what to do. They were just eating it up. They were gladly bearing with these people. Even makes the statement there in verse 20, one strikes you on the face, the New King James Version. Literally in the original language, it takes your skin. And it's actually, in the Greek language, it's the idea of scourging somebody. Remember when they would scourge somebody, a lot of times it was a whip with a lot of different ends, and they would tie sharp pieces in it that would fillet the skin whenever they did them. So literally he's saying they're taking the skin off of you, and you're just putting your arm around them and inviting them into your house. So, Paul was upset with them because they were putting up with foolish people and fools too easily. And, I kind of got to thinking about us sometimes. Well, maybe I shouldn't say us. Maybe I should say me individually. But sometimes I think, well, how ignorant could I have been? Sometimes I think it's just the course of human nature over time. I don't care who you are, eventually you're going to be wrong on something. You're going to believe something to be one way when it's actually another way. Sometimes you step back after you realize that and you look at that and you think about how ignorant could the person have been? How could I not have seen that? How could I be so foolish? And how could I put up with people who, would act that way and accept it? Well, it's kind of human nature, isn't it? But it aggravated Paul because that's what they were doing. They were putting up with fools and they were putting up with foolishness. So Paul gives all kinds of examples there in verses 22 through 28 of some of the hardships that he endured. And why does he do that?
I mean, he's pointing out that while these guys are saying, look at me, I'm this great apostle. By the way, I need you to pay for my ride, buy me food, put me up in your house. He's out here spreading the gospel, and he's being shipwrecked. The one that really, really jumps out is 5 times he took 40 lashes, save one.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole lot of lashes. Whereas these guys are walking around, I'm sure they're perfumed, I'm sure they have nice robes, I'm sure that their skin is soft and clean. Whereas he's walking around with, well, I mean, 195 scars from the lash.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes a point of, and this whole part makes me feel like in modern terms, he would have called them sheeple. You've heard the term sheeple?
Yeah.
You'll follow anybody if someone says, "Oh, come this way," we're going to go that way. You just follow. And that's kind of what it feels like. He's like, y'all are just following whoever tells you what to do.
Yeah, and that's really what, he was so upset about. Because if they would just stop and look and use some common sense, I mean, it's pretty obvious who the apostle is and who isn't. And that's what he's talking about here. What have they suffered for, for the name of Christ? What have they gone through? Are they super apostles? Well, what does that make me? Am I below them? And when it comes to suffering, have I done, have I endured more for the service of Christ than they have? And so again, it's that idea. It's not what Paul wanted to write to them about, but it's how he had to write to them, because that's the only thing that they were willing to listen to. So the last one here is, how does Paul qualify his boasting here in verse 30?
I think we need to back up to one more verse before that, 29, because the indignation, he did not have that. He never lost faith. He never got disgruntled. He never was disenchanted with his journey, with his message. So that gave him the right to, that was his infirmity, was he admitted his weakness, but he never lost sight of it.
Yeah, when Paul was bragging here, now think about this. When people brag about themselves, what kind of stuff do they usually brag about?
The good stuff.
Yeah, the good stuff, right? We don't brag about bad stuff, do we? We don't brag about suffering and hardships and things like that. And that's what Paul's saying here. That's what I'm bragging to you about. Not these guys. They're out here talking about all these great qualities that they possess, all these good things that they can do. He said, my boasting is in my weaknesses. Suffering for Christ. The great love and the care that I have for you. Those are not things that people usually go around and brag about. But it's more things that we would, think of as appealing to the flesh. So Paul pointed out, even though I'm boasting, understand that I'm not boasting about powerful things of myself. I'm talking about weaknesses, infirmities that I've gone through and I've had to experience that make me a servant for Christ. So that's what he's doing in these two chapters. Again, if you're not aware of that, makes kind of rough reading and kind of interpretation, but understand the reason why he did it and the importance of it. So we actually made it through one of these. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments or questions? Go ahead, brother.
I got a side note question. Do you think, I know it's a opinion question, we can't prove one or another. Do you think when Paul was stoned, he died? Because it talks about him dragging him out and they gathered around him and prayed. I sort of thought maybe he died and they prayed to God and God raised him back.
Yeah.
You do?
Yeah, because, like you said, if the people drug him out of the city,
They thought he was dead.
yeah. I mean, that's the only reason to go. If he was still alive, they would have picked him up and took him into the house and nursed him, tried to get him back to health. But yeah, I think they probably believed that he was dead. Of course, there's always the question, was he really dead or was he just unconscious for a while? But, well, maybe next week we'll talk about a little bit the vision that he had there in chapter 12. So,
But I mean, the point being, he could have actually given his very life for him by this point,
Yeah. And I don't know that Paul, if when he writes there in chapter 12, if that's the experience he's writing about, he says himself, I don't know if I was dead or alive. I don't know if I was in the body or I was out of the body. I just know this is what happened, when it did happen. So, Yeah, it's a pause for reflection, I guess. But yeah, he could have written a lot more than what he wrote about the things he'd suffered for the cause of Christ. So, anybody else?